So let me begin by saying that it was, for us at the Afro-Middle East Center, Egypt has been a context that we've been focusing on, for a good few years, but certainly in the past 3 years that we've been giving strong focus to, and the unfolding developments from the uprisings that began in 2011. And as an aside, I should say that we've been quite, and I'm sure that some of the Egyptians won't like this, but we've been quite firm in not referring to what happened in Egypt in 2011 as a revolution, because we didn't believe that a revolution had taken place in 2011 in Egypt. And according to Shamil, no revolutions, there were not half a dozen revolutions in the past 3 years, but there wasn't a revolution that took place in 2011. There wasn't fundamental change in Egyptian society that justified it to be called a revolution. But the uprisings that took place in 2011, from then until the beginnings of democratic processes in that country, with the referendum and the elections that took place, and right up to last year with the military coup in July. Throughout this period, we were quite insistent on one other thing, and that is that despite the fact that there were the beginnings of democracy, that you had these elections that took place and a referendum that took place, which are indicators of democracy, and you had a democratically elected president that was placed in power with half a parliament, because the other half was dissolved before the president was elected, that despite all of this, that it was clear that the military was really still in charge in Egypt. And we now see that is the case. That even in the period, in the 1 year that Mohammed Morsi was the president of Egypt, or was in office, I should say, because we might argue that he still is the president, even in the 1 year that he was in office, that the military was very much in charge in Egypt, and other sections of the security forces. The statement by a senior policeman, as one of the speakers said earlier on, that I'll take a 4-year vacation, is an indicator of that they were really in charge, as much as we might have like to have thought otherwise. So yes, there were various programs that were put into place by the new government, etc., but those programs were only allowed to go anywhere if the military felt that they should. And finally, when it just was overstepping its bounds, then they stepped back in and took back full power. And so the situation we see in Egypt today is this kind of unfolding of a process in which those who were in power decided that they would allow some concessions, that they would allow some processes to unfold that would seem like there's a change, that would justify the suggestion that there was a revolution, but while in fact not actually allowing that situation to take place. And so we are now back in full circle, in some ways back to where we were in 2010 in Egypt, but in other ways we have progressed, and I use that term carefully, beyond 2010. And the reason I say that is because I think that the repression that's currently taking place in Egypt is much worse than what Egyptians faced in 2010 under Mubarak. And so you have a state that is back under military rule as it was in 2010. The military having more firmly established itself, because by 2010 there was the threat that Mubarak was going to slowly, and he had in fact started doing that, move away from the military in some ways, wanting to put his son in power, etc. The military has taken all that back and is much more firmly in charge. And they've decided that all of this nonsense about democracy and all of these adventurous people who want to have elections where there's a free and fair vote, that had its day, and its time is over. And so you will now find elections where you'll have results of 98%. And so we are back in Egypt where we were. And the idea, I think Egypt is also an indicator that this notion that we had great revolutions across the Middle East and North Africa region, that we should have been much more careful about suggesting that there were revolutions popping up all over the place in all of these countries. If we look at all of the various countries that we spoke about so excitedly in 2011, I think we would be much more careful today to suggest that there were revolutions in all of those countries. I'm not going to say in any of them, but in all of those countries. I'm not suggesting that revolution is not possible in the Middle East, North Africa region. I think it's very possible, and I think it's very necessary. And I think it will come. But I also believe that revolutions are much longer processes than 18 days. That processes, that revolutions unfold over time. That we determine that revolutions have taken place when we see fundamental changes taking place within society, within governance, etc. And by a few martyrs being sacrificed, and one president being kicked out by his colleagues, as was the case in Egypt, it doesn't make a revolution. So I think that the past year, if not a little longer than that, has been very sobering for many of us, for all of us that were extremely excited in 2011 about what was happening and about the possibilities of where this could go. The other sobering aspect, I think, is that we often, those of us that think of ourselves either as revolutionaries or as close followers of revolutions or as supporters of revolutions, we often underestimate or get so taken up in our euphoria of what we think are revolutionary moments that we forget that there are also counter-revolutions and counter-revolutionary forces that operate in the background. And certainly some of the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, have shown that that's what they are and that's what they represent. Many of us for the past, from the beginning of 2011 until the middle of 2013, ignored the kind of role that Saudi Arabia and UAE could play, except for looking at the potential, for example, for uprisings to take place in Saudi Arabia, but didn't look carefully enough at what kind of role they could play in the region as a whole, even though they talked about expanding the GCC, co-opting Jordan, etc. And I think that these are all lessons for us. I don't want to leave us on a despondent and sad note. I think that such lessons are always useful when we are planning on how to create new futures in whichever society that might be, whether it's in a military dictatorship as Egypt is today, whether it's in a democracy with its own set of problems as South Africa is today. As we are planning on what kind of futures we should envisage and look forward to, I think sober thinking is always useful and important. And so I think that for our Egyptian colleagues, that sober thinking about where we are and how the future might unfold is absolutely necessary. And perhaps also necessary is that we think, as I think it was Shamil who said, that we think in periods of at least 10 years or more, not in periods of 1 year or 2 years or 2 months or 18 days, as I said earlier on. And if I could just say that I'm not saying this just off the top of my head. Many of us in South Africa believe that 20 years now, in 3 months' time it will be 20 years since our first democratic elections, that 20 years after our first democratic election, we are still in a period of transition because we still have not dealt with many of the fundamental problems that face our society. And those problems will still take a while to deal with. If anyone told us one year after Mandela became president that your time is now up, you haven't sorted this out, now you have to leave, we would have had a revolution. So we also think that we have processes that unfold over long periods of time. We are in part of that process, one of those processes. And those processes will see successes, and they will see setbacks, and they will see failures. And we, in South Africa, we see them all the time, all of those. Successes, setbacks, and failures. And sometimes the failures last for more than a short while. Sometimes the failures last for a year, or 2 years, or 4 years, or 5 years, before things get back on track. And we will experience that too. So, I want to suggest that this symposium that we've had today is one in a process of many deliberations. From us as the Afro-Middle East Center, being a South African institute, this is part of our contribution towards examining what is happening in the Middle East, North Africa region, and particularly what is happening in the North Africa region as part of the African continent, and looking at how we as an institute and also how our country, South Africa, might play a role in furthering the process of democratization on our continent and in that region as a whole. We quite willing and happy to take forward our engagement in this, whether it's regarding Syria, whether it's regarding Egypt, or other countries, including Syria, since I said that accidentally. And just since I've mentioned Syria, let me say that in the tone that I have made my earlier remarks, I was actually quite surprised and shocked when in the media, after 2 days of Geneva II opening, there were all these commentary and statements about how, you know, this process is going to fail because, look, on the first day everyone took such hardline positions. Do people really believe that negotiations take 2 days? In a situation where more than 100,000 lives have been lost, where 2 million people have been displaced from their homes, where people have become such staunch enemies to each other, many of whom have lived in exile for decades, that all of that will be resolved in negotiations over 2 days. In our case, it took us 4 years before we had from when negotiations began to 4 years, 4.5 years, before we had our first democratic elections. Negotiations don't take 2 days. And I think that we are all too, perhaps part of the thing is that we often, many of us thought of these uprisings in the Middle East, North Africa region as being the social media uprisings, the Twitter uprisings, some people said. And so we think that like we're able to write messages in 140 characters, that time also unfolds that fast. In 140 seconds, you should have a revolution. It doesn't, fortunately. It doesn't happen like that. And we need to be more patient and more engaging with these processes. With those words, I want to say that in the last session, what we spoke about in terms of the futures, possible futures for Egypt, I think that these are the kinds of things that we would like to explore and look at more carefully in terms of what are the potential scenarios, how these might unfold, and what the role of other countries on the continent might be, like South Africa, to be able to play in that. I want to end then by thanking all of you for attending the symposium today, thanking particularly our 5 guest speakers from outside of South Africa. Although Rodney, I'm not sure that I should say 4.5, because Rodney is South African. He's not from outside of South Africa, really. So 4.5 guest speakers, as well as the local guest speakers that were here, Professors Shamil Jepi and Daryl Glazer. Our international guest speakers, as I said, Rodney Dixon, Dr. Mahmoud Hussein, here somewhere, Dr. Ihab Shihabi, Minister Yahya Hamid, and Sister Sumaya Al-Ganaini. So thank you to all of you for attending. Sorry? And thank you as well. And thank you for IHH for having partnered with us on organizing this this symposium, and for all the assistance that was provided by them to try and make sure that this happened under very difficult challenges for both of us. But we'll talk over that. We'll talk about that over tea later. Is there anyone else, Nazli, that I've missed that I should be thanking? The Deputy Minister, of course, South African Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, and his team that attended this morning. And thank you also, although he's not here, but the message will get to him. I am told that our government ministers have very good intelligence, so they'll hear what I'm saying. Thanks to him for not only speaking this morning, but also for staying for the rest of the morning until lunch to listen to what others had to say as well. Nazli? Member of Parliament from Turkey for attending, and all of those who came from outside of South Africa. Actually, there were quite a few. I don't know who they all are, but there were about at least 10 non-South Africans, apart from the guests who came to speak, 10 non-South Africans who flew in to attend the symposium. Thanks to all of you, and thank you as always to the Sheraton for the facilities they provide, even though we have to pay for it, but thanks to them. Thank you all, and please enjoy your tea, and we hope that you continue engaging on this topic.